didn't God help the Jewish people survive? Isn't Jewish survival a miracle? And the reality is, if you look at people who have survived well, the Chinese are doing much better than we are in terms of raw numbers and continuity of language and civilization. Hindu civilization also goes back quite a long way in their own land. We didn't do so well on that own land thing for a long time. But we survived in part because of human effort. In fact, largely because of human effort. Sometimes we were lucky. Sometimes we worked for it. If circumstances were bad, we chose to move. We had a niche to play in the European economy, or as traders between the Muslim world and the Christian world, because we were neither, so we could cross those borders, both in an economic interchange sense, but also in cultural interchange. The Renaissance was because of Jewish translators who put it from Arabic back into Greek and Latin. We had skills that were needed, whether it was commerce skills or literacy skills. The mass of the population were not literate, but Jews were literate, and that gave them a niche to function. They were not tied to the land like the serfs, or tied to the cities like the manufacturers, the burghers, and the craftsmen, and the guilds. But they could go in between the two. And so they brought raw products to the cities, and they brought the manufactured products back to the countryside. So these are why the Jews survived. They survived from human effort. If anything, Jewish history is a testimony not to the kindness of the fates and the universe, but to the importance and power of human effort, human responsibility, and human power to try to affect their life as best as possible given the circumstances of an uncaring universe. Yes?
After yesterday's discussion where you mentioned that we really weren't slaves in Egypt, I was wondering, you know, if we accept Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob
as characters, sure.
Well, call ourselves Israelites and Jews because Judea, so...
Well, Judea is a historic place. There's archaeology, there's evidence for it.
There's no tribe of Judah, but so where did we come from?
Okay. Well, this is why we have to make a distinction between where we really came from and the national origin myth. So I'll sometimes use the analogy of, imagine there was a Mr. America who came to a new continent, and he had 50 sons. And those 50 sons spread out all over this continent. Some stayed close to where Mr. America landed, and so they wound up in New York and Pennsylvania, stayed close by, and then some of the more adventurous sons went further west, like Michigan and Indiana, and the Dakota twins wound up on the north end of things, and then California, the most adventurous, got all the way to the next ocean. And then they had children like Sacramento and San Francisco and Los Angeles. Now that would sound absurd, right? But that's what the biblical narrative is doing. It's describing tribes in areas. Israel is the name of the nation. And each of his 12 sons are 12 tribes that define territory and a people. It's taking geographic history and putting it into a family story. It's an origin story. We have no problem saying the creation story of Adam and Eve is not history. We have no problem saying the flood story is not history. There's no evidence for a global flood. Plus, it just doesn't make sense. How do the kangaroos get there? And so then the question is, where do you draw that fiction line? And it may be that the fiction line is drawn sometime much later than we're used to drawing it. Maybe post-patriarchs, maybe post-Exodus, maybe even post-Saul and David and Solomon's monarchy. Now, we found an inscription in the desert that refers to a house of David from a couple centuries after David might have lived. So if there was a house of David being referred to, then it's plausible there was some kind of David. Now, was he good with the harp? Could he write psalms? Was he good with the slingshot? There's no data to prove that. But a reference to some David makes that plausible. But the kind of kingdom that he claimed to own isn't reflected in the archaeology. So maybe it was a bit of, propaganda. The king's historians were writing the king's version of history. And what we have in archaeology doesn't always reflect what the king wanted to hear. So this is part of our challenge when we look back at Jewish history. We want to find the real history. And it may be disappointing. It may be undermining our stories we've always been told. It may make celebrating Passover a little bit more complicated, because we can't just assume the way we've told it is the way it happened. But this is our responsibility to Jewish history, to find out the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Because we want to base on what we do on the truth. We can tell the stories as stories. There is inspirational power. But there's also the sense of what really happened and why. And that's why we have a responsibility to the facts.
You know, so clearly, you cast a cyber glance at those offers to have your DNA tested to see if you have the Cohen gene or...
Well, no, that's something that's been demonstrated scientifically that there is. Now, whether there was an Aaron and whether he helped Moses confront Pharaoh, that's a different question. But the fact that there is a caste within the Jewish tribes that is identified as a priestly caste, and guess what? Your priestly status is passed down from father to son. Guess what else is passed down from father to son? The Y chromosome. So if you're looking for a Y chromosome trait indicative of a priestly caste where the status passes down father to son, and so does the Y chromosome, then it's likely that that will come out in a population study. So again, we're looking at the data, and you have to decide how you interpret that data. And this is true on a theological level too. A man grew up once in a Bible-believing community in Texas, very religious setting, but he himself just didn't believe it. And so one day he goes out into a field, and he says, all right, God, if you're out there, I want you to give me a sign right now. And a shooting star goes right across the sky. And he says, wow, what a coincidence. So sometimes the data confirms your religious perspective. So those who want to see the Cohen DNA data confirming the whole tradition of Cohen's going back to Aaron, going back to the Torah and Sinai, they'll do that. Others will say what this data shows is the Jews had a priestly group that tracked its identity male, father to son, and the Y chromosome went father to son, so it's plausible that there's this group that claims a common male ancestor at some point in time. Now, whether it's in 1200 BCE, in the time of Aaron and Moses, supposedly, or it starts in 500 BCE with the return from exile and the reestablishment of the Zadokites as the priestly caste in Jerusalem when the second temple was built, that's a question for geneticists to debate. The second is more historically plausible. The first is the claim of the religious tradition.